Recording is on.
Que me encante. How is everybody doing tonight? Hopefully great. Today I wanted to share a slide in regards to how to say indigenous or native in Nahuatl. This is something many people always ask. And well, there's a short answer and then there's a longer answer. The short answer is to simply tell you how to say it. And that's good to learn how words are said. But sometimes it's even better to learn where these words originate and the history behind these words, because it gives you a little bit of insight into the way of thinking, the cultural mode of perceiving things, which aren't always the same, as most of you probably know, as the European mode, especially in regards to race, ethnicity, and whatnot. So let me share the slide here, and then we'll begin. Bear with me. So how to say indigenous or native in Nahuatl. This is the short answer. The short answer is to say Masewali. Now, this is pretty much across all Nahuatl variants that I'm aware of. Maybe there's another one. If you know of another way to say indigenous in your variant of Nahuatl or the variant you're learning, please comment and share that with us. But the common way that we're going to see from the historical record is Masewali. In Jalisco, we say Masewal, which is just a shortened form of Masewali. The plural of this depends on the variant you're dealing with. Some say Masewaltim, some say Masewalme. Masewaltim is more often found in the central variants, especially what is called classical Nahuatl, or the mode of speaking as was spoken by the Mexica and others in the valley there of Mexico. So this is the short answer. But we're going to talk about it. So these are some of the orthographic variants or different ways of spelling. Now, there's no consensus on how to spell a word in Nahuatl. There's different orthographies or spelling conventions used. So these are some of them. Now, at the bottom, you're going to see the one by Francis Cartooni, in which she marks vowel length. Long vowel A, long vowel E. This is important because there are some other words or another word which is exactly the same almost, but which has a different vowel length and a glottal stop. We're going to get to that later. And I believe that these terms are related, although not everybody has that same idea or has reached that same conclusion. Now, we have to talk about this idea about indigenous as opposed to non-indigenous. Obviously, prior to European contact, indigenous people did not view themselves as indigenous to the American continent as opposed to other people. There were no other known land masses per se, and the people did not hold the notion of races or nationalities in the European sense. In Nahuatl, people were most often identified based upon their place of origin, their language, and rarely a descriptive term. Within some societies that spoke Nahuatl, there also existed a type of class system from which the modern term Masewali is derived. So here's how, basically, some examples of how people were described in Nahuatl. Excuse me. So the first example here is location. This is the most common way. A person is from whatever area they're from. This would be equivalent to like saying a Californian person from Californian, Mexican or Mexicano, a person from Mexico, etc. The first one here we see is an example of a Castiltecat. This was one of the original forms to reference a person from Spain. The majority of Spaniards that came here came from Castilla. And if I'm not mistaken, the form of Spanish that we speak in Mexico, the variant of Spanish is from this area as well. So the Nahuatl people that encountered the first Europeans or Spaniards referred to them as Castiltecat, or people from Castilla. Another example is the famous Mexicat. Mexicat simply means a person from Mexico or Mexico, and referenced not the country, but simply one location, which today is referred to as Mexico City. As you can see, both of these examples have cat as their suffix. The first one is tecat, the second is cat. These are both related. They simply mean a person or entity. And there's numerous examples of this. In regards to language, people were sometimes identified as by their language. Usually, Nahuatl speakers identified people who did not speak their language as speaking some other language, or like a strange language, a strange way of speaking. And we have these examples, Popoloca and Pinot. Those are just two examples. There are many. Pinot is interesting because in the historical record from colonial times in Jalisco, you see this term applied to many indigenous groups. They say, oh, they're Pinome, they're Pinot, they're Pinol. And this mainly means that they did not speak Nahuatl. They spoke another language that was not similar to Nahuatl or Purepecha, which were languages that the Spaniards were well familiar with, as well as their soldiers who they brought with them, which were primarily speakers of central varieties of Nahuatl. A descriptive term. More rarely we find descriptive terms, such as this, Cuacuatat. Now, this is a term that was used to reference the Mazateco people, and it means simply person who wears a sling about their head. Now, the general term for person is simply tlacat. Tlacat simply means a human or a person. This was a general term for all people. Everybody was tlacat because everybody went through the system of being born. This is where we get the verb tlacati, to be born or to become human. At the bottom here, I give the example tecat. Tecat means a person, or we can say person from, and it's attached to locative nouns. And there's a process for doing that. We don't have time to explain that, but whenever you see tecat or teca, the plural form, or a variant of that, it means person from that. In Jalisco, we usually find that format, at least in southern Jalisco, as teco. Central and southern Jalisco, teco. So, for example, my people were from Tamazula, but we're referred to as Tamazulteco, historically and in modern times. So, indigenous and Nahuatl. So, while the concept of indigenous or native people may be foreign to Nahuatl thought and culture, it could be expressed in Nahuatl. For example, if one wanted to say a certain animal or plant was indigenous to a certain area, one would basically say that the animal or plant is from here, or not from here, but from far away. Thus, in Nahuatl, the literal sense is used to signify indigenous or native. This word is Nika, which is most often translated as here or it is here. But in this context, will be translated as from here. Here's an example from the Florentine Codex. I'm just going to read the second part. Intechpa tlatoa inikantotolme, which loosely translates as which telleth of the native Turkey, or which talks about the Turkey from here. The word totolme or totolin also was utilized to talk about the chicken or the European, which came with the Europeans, or the European hen. So here they're making this distinction between the European chicken and the domesticated turkey, which is referred to as totolin. And then there's another term that references the male turkey. So this is kind of like the general term for the female turkey or the hen. And in some other variants, they have other words. For example, in Southern Jalisco, we also have the word pichu. This is how we say turkey. So, colonial contact. With the colonization of central Mexico, terms had to be created or translated into Nahuatl to signify the various ideas and concepts the Spanish had regarding race, ethnicity, caste, etc. This includes the concept of the original people from this hemisphere being Indian, native, or indigenous. In Spanish, gente de aquí, naturales, or more commonly, indios. In the beginning, this concept was rendered through a basic translation of the Spanish gente de aquí, which more or less coincides with the Nahuatl mode of saying something is from here or indigenous to here. Thus, the first usage of a Nahuatl term to signify Indio or natural was the term Nicantlaca or Nicantitlaca, as we're going to see. Now, there's a big debate about this, and people try to say Nicantlaca or Nicantlacat. This is not linguistically correct, and the Mexica movement uses this term, and a lot of people are against them. So they don't want to accept this term, and no modern variants of Nahuatl use this term. Now, it is true that no modern variants use this term in regards to people, but the term Nican is used when referencing or talking about indigenous plants or animals. And historically, we see that this term is historically used, but fell out of use and was later replaced by the term Masewali. We have to keep in mind that the whole idea of being indigenous person or indio or indígena, these are all cultural constructs that were created during colonial times. So here are some examples. We're going to look at some examples of the term Nicantlaca, or indigenous people, and we're going to talk about the different ways that it's used. So through much of the 16th century, before Masewali became dominant, the same sense had been expressed by the phrase Nicantitlaca, we people here. Literally, we people here, or loosely, we indigenous people, which faded after 1600 or the 17th century. Now, Chimalpahi, who was a Nahua historian from Chalco, he used this term very often. And he would use it as a stylistic alternative to Masewali, or use the two together, which is very common in Nahuatl, to utilize two terms to reference one idea. So, for example, the people were often referred to as Atlapali, Quitlapili, the tail, the wings and the tail. And this was translated as just simply the people or the common people, which, from my understanding, referenced the people as being like the wings and tails, while the leaders of society, or the pili, were the head and body. So there's numerous sources. There's historical sources written by Nahuatl speakers, Nahuatl indigenous people. Another one here is Nikamotonewa, Inixihuatlania, and Nicantlaka. Here is related how the natives fought or looked for wives. That one's from Sahugun. And the next one, example here, which I like a lot from Molina, is Kipalewiski and Amo San Yukan Nikantlakat, Oxenka Yewante Newekatlaka Kimopalewiski. And here we see Nikantlakat and Wekatlakat, which are basically exact opposites. Wekatlakat or Wekatlaka is translated as foreigners, while Nikantlakat is translated as locals. What's interesting about this last example is that Nikantlakat is obviously singular, yet it's being used in a generic plural sense, and it's translated as indigenous people. This is an argument people sometimes make against the usage of the term. Oh, it's not grammatically correct to use it in that way. So here he shouldn't have said Nikantlakat. He should have said Nikantlaka. Maybe it was a typo, perhaps. So the replacement of the term Nikantlaka. So by 17th century, which is the 1600s, the term Nikantlaka began to be replaced by the term Masewali, which still finds its usage, and at times its usage alongside Masewali. So you'll see, as we're going to see from the historical record, that originally Nikantlaka was the term utilized in referencing indigenous people as a whole, regardless of so-called nobility or common people, commoners. This is because the term Masewali originally, as we'll see, had other connotations, at least in central Mexico at the time of contact. Okay. All right. So here we have the two terms utilized in conjunction, and this is by Chimapai. But I want to point out here, and I highlighted them in a darker script, a couple other terms that we see. So, for example, I'm not going to read the whole text, but Tliltique is blacks. It's just a literal translation of negros. And here we see it used in reference to black people. And then you see another term, interesting term, españolestin, which is Spanish, españoles, right? Españoles, which comes from the word for Spaniards, and tin, which is a plural Nahuatl, plural suffix. Again, we have a Tliltic Siwat, which is talking about a black woman, and then Tliltique. So they're talking about conflict that happened within the city that included Spaniards, characters that include Spaniards, African Americans or blacks, and then indigenous people, which are referred to as Nicantitlacati Masewalti. We people from here, we indigenous people, we commoners, right? They're used in conjunction basically as the same. However, you may argue that there was a slight distinction being made in which they were specifically identifying which group of Nicantlaka were being referenced, which in this case happened to be commoners. Another example, in this one here, we see that the Nicantlaka and Masahualtin are utilized simply to refer to indigenous people. And here's another example as well of another way to say Spaniards, Castilan-Tlaca, or people from Castile or Castilla, Spain, which a certain region in Spain. And this is not from Chimalpain, but this is from 1559, Luis Reyes Garcia. So here are some terms for ethnic markers that more or less were created in colonial times. Obviously, the Spaniards, one, Castiltecat, Castilan-Tlacat. Those would be the Nahuatl ways of referencing Spanish, which slowly that term also fell out of disfavor and was replaced by Españoles. In other places, the term for a Spaniard was something else, like maybe a coyote or coyome, as they use in the eastern part, Eastern Nahuatl speakers, Huasteca, or like a Cristiano, which is the form that's preserved in Jalisco and coastal Michoacan, Colima, and I believe other areas in Central also use the variant of Cristiano, which simply is a Nahuatlized form of the word Cristiano, which the Spaniards utilized to reference themselves. Next, we have Nicantlacatl. This is translated as an indigenous person or person from here. Another example from the Florentine Codex is Nicanchaneque. Chaneque simply means a dweller, one who possesses a house. Chantli. Chane means one who possesses a house or a dweller, citizen. So today, it's sometimes just translated as like a citizen. And then slowly, those terms fell out of disfavor, and we have Masewali. But we also have within Molina has other examples such as Masewal or Milacat. Milacat is just simply from Mili, field, and Tlacat, person, combined, compound noun. It would probably be more just better translated as like a person that works in the fields or a country person. It's in regards to the term mestizo, which terms had to be created for that as well, since we're living under a caste system. Itlacao Nelonki was one that is recorded by Molina. The most common one was simply to use a mestizotzin or mestizos, just as literal translation. That was found in Chimalpain. And then there's also the Yancuitlacat, the new people or new person. And I couldn't find the source on that, but I know for pretty much the fact I've seen it in the historical documents. And then a black person is a Tliltic Tlacat or simply Tliltic. So those are some examples of the historical markers. Now in the 16th century, which we have records of the term Masewali. And as we can see, we're going to see that most often it was never translated as indigenous person. For example, the oldest reference I have found from 1547 Masewali is simply just translated as a vassal, right? Molina, vassal, 1579. Duran, 1579, he has this translated as Masewali as hombre de pueblo. And this is very important. He also says, en cuanto merecido por el sacrificio de los dioses. This is an important entry, I think, because it shows that we see that the original term, as many linguists believe, that Masewali originally just referenced people in general. But here we see it tied in with what they refer to as a sacrifice and deserving, which goes to the etymology of this term, although some people debate that. Again, the Florentine Codex Masewali is simply basically translated as a common person, commoners, and Disosomok, the last one entry here, he's translated basically as a poor, miserable person or vassals. So you see, these ones are dealing, most of the early entries are dealing with the hierarchical system that the Mexica had, in which there was commoners, and then there was slaves, and then there was so-called lords or ruling class. But this didn't apply. I don't believe that this applied to Nahua people outside of this region or more rural areas who didn't have this distinction. So as the time keeps going, 17th century sources, and we get to the 1600s, we see the term start to change. Masewali is still recorded as vasallo or vassal, and Chimalpain starts to record it as a poor person or indigenous person as well. So it still has both senses, commoner, but it slowly starting to shift into the meaning of indigenous person, right? Alarcon, same thing. He has it as a vassal, but it's starting to shift. Here we see in 1634, it's totally shifted to natural or indio, at least by this author. And then Carochi, who is the one most quoted for the presence of vowel length, he records it simply as an indigenous person, but he also records it as a human being and commoner. So I believe he's recorded basically all three stages of its original use: the original human being, then later as the society became more stratified, commoner, and then later during colonial times, indigenous person. So the change in the definition. So the Masewali, it changed its definition: common person or not noble, human being. This was the original definition. And after some time, after 1600s, it was utilized to refer to indigenous people. How, especially in the plural. So when we say, when they said Masewali, it definitely was referencing indigenous person. When it was possessed, it usually always meant a vassal or someone's subject. And this is just a quote from Lockhart, which is a well-known linguist, and he's basically came to the same conclusion that I did, that it originally have meant human being, but by the 16th century, often referred to social rank, to a commoner, as opposed to a noble. Although in the plural or collective, it still could approach the sense of the people. By around the 1600s, this word, while often retaining its earlier senses, was becoming the primary term for indigenous people when their Altepec, their location, remember we talked about in Nahuatl, they usually say what city or location they're from, or other affiliations were not mentioned, often appearing in the first person plural. Um, its field of reference in this sense was virtually the same as Spanish Indio or Indian. In some cases, it can be seen as an attempt to find equivalent for the Spanish word. So as Nahuatl speakers or now historians and even Spaniards that were writing in Nahuatl were trying to uh, find a term that fit with the Spanish concepts of indigenous as opposed to European, foreigner, and black, white, mestizo, and all these different caste systems they had. Masawali became the go-to term. Now, what I found was very interesting here and could possibly shed some light on the origin of the word, original meaning of the word is Masawali, is that, well, the Nahua people, certain groups of Nahua people also conquered and colonized other non-Nahua indigenous people. And sometimes words were borrowed into that language. And we have a historical record of the Yucatec Mayans being conquered um, in two different waves in 1816 and 987. This is said to have happened during the collapse of Tula or of the Tolteca. And words were adopted into Yucatec Mayan, which they still use to this day. And one of those words that they still use to this day is Masewal. And it has this basically the exact same meaning, which was a commoner, poor person. And then today it references indigenous person or Indio, although I believe they also have other terms that connotate the same thing. So I thought that was interesting. I wanted to share that in Yucatec Maya. And you can look that up for further reference. Now, what I found interesting here was in looking towards the etymology of the original term. Now, we're not going to delve too much into that because that's going to be another video. But Masewali is the only term used in the creation stories when they're referencing the creation of the world or the creation of people. So here from the Leyenda de Soles or the Codex Chimalpopoca, they reference humans, Masewalti, being born because the Teteo did penance. And I thought that was really interesting because it shows that originally this term, Masewali, Masewalti in the plural, was utilized to identify all people, regardless of classification. And if we're thinking of the creation, you have to think, well, in the beginning there were no Pili, as opposed to Masewali, as opposed to the slaves that they had and other ranks. So I want to get into that later, into the origin of the word, and we're going to end it here. But it seems that originally the word Masewali originally simply meant a person or a community member and made reference to ones participating in what they referred to as Tlamasawalisli, which I loosely translate as the act of giving and receiving. Usually it's translated simply as to do penance or sacrifice. But as you see from the historical record, from the creation stories, it's usually utilized in a way that means a cycle of giving and receiving is begun. Here, the Teteo, they did self-sacrifice, right? And in turn, humans became obligated, or Masewali became obligated to do that. And there's numerous sources that allude to that, including the creation of the sun, which I'm listing here as well. This is from the Florentine Codex. And here we have Masewalti have been born, because they did penance for us, because the Teteo did penance for us. So there's a connection between the act of penance and the term Masawali, in my opinion, and some others' opinions. And we're going to get into that soon. So I want to go ahead and end that there. If you have any questions, go ahead and put your questions at the bottom. Any comments? Please, let's keep it positive. And thanks everybody for watching, and hopefully I was able to shed a little light. So in Nahuatl today, the term Masawali is a term we utilize to reference an indigenous person. In some communities, it doesn't just mean like an indigenous person, but it means a person from the community. When you leave that community and you take on the characteristics of the more dominant Spanish society, then sometimes you're no longer Masawali, even though genetically you are. You become a Coyome, or you become a Cristiano. In Mexicano and Jalisco now we have a term Cristiano Pampas, and this is utilized to refer to an indigenous person that takes on the characteristics or the style of imitating the Spanish, the larger Spanish speaking population. So thanks everybody for watching. Nimitsewi Meme Timoitaske.